You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're recording this for the benefit of my son, Ben, but because we know there's so many Star Trek fans out there, we're recording and releasing these for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm good, Jay. How about you?
I'm doing really well. I'm actually very excited about tonight's episode.
Yes.
We are reviewing Who Watches the Watchers, Season 3, Episode 4, which debuted on October 16th, 1989, with a star date of 43173.5. And in many ways, I think this episode is quintessential Star Wars. I'm sorry, not Star Wars, Star Trek. I've been doing that a lot. I'm so sorry, folks. We got Disney Plus, and we've been watching Star Wars again. But I think this episode is quintessential Star Trek, especially for Next Generation and for the third season, which is kind of universally agreed upon as the upswing in the quality for the Next Generation franchise.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is a really well put together episode with a lot of really heavy ideas that are presented in a really digestible way, and I find very little fault with the episode. I thought it was very good. Before we really dig into it, what did you think about it?
Oh, I'd agree with everything that you just said.
Okay. So let's get the audience up to speed with what's going on. So there is a scheduled visit by the Enterprise D to Mintaka 3 to update and resupply an observation outpost that is studying the Mintakans, who are a proto-Vulcan humanoid society at a Bronze Age level, and they are using a holographic wall or a duck blind to conduct an anthropological study of the civilization. When they get there, there is a worry of a power failure, which causes a huge amount of panic because there's a worry that the Prime Directive, which basically says that Starfleet or the Federation in general cannot interfere with pre-warp societies. There's the worry that if the duck blind is revealed, the Mintakans will, of course, discover the anthropologist, and the Prime Directive will have been violated because they will have begun the process of culturally contaminating and affecting the outcome and history of their culture. So this is, of course, kicked into high gear because there's a power failure at the duck blind, which causes a large amount of injuries, and causes Picard to increase the speed of the Enterprise to warp 9. So we've actually seen the duck blind. I don't. So this is the first time I think I've seen the duck blind in Next Generation, but we actually see this used later on in the movie Insurrection,
Mm-hmm.
when they are going to have to when the crew of the Enterprise E, which is the entire crew of the D, have to go rescue Data from, I think, God, I forget what the planet's called. It's in the quote unquote Briar Patch, but
Mm-hmm.
they're using a duck blind to basically observe these people on this planet. It's a very complex film about relocation and resettlement, but that's something we'll get into later. What do you think about the idea of the duck blind and how the Federation is observing these proto-Vulcan humanoids that are at a quote-unquote Bronze Age level, and we'll, after you answer my question, we'll dig into the Bronze Age aspect of it.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, it sort of makes sense that if you have this opportunity that you can study a more primitive society to understand its dynamics because, it can sort of provide a mirror to your own species and culture's
Mm-hmm.
development. But I thought it was interesting that it was Proto Vulcan. And when you look at the
Mm-hmm.
Federation people that are in the duck blind, I said, why aren't there a bunch of Vulcans here? Because they're the ones that should, if they're Proto Vulcan, it's Vulcan anthropologists that should be studying these people.
I thought that was an excellent question, but I think it also gets to one of the implicit problems, even for Next Generation, where a lot of the crew is just, with the exception of Worf and Data, um, everyone for the most part is humanoid.
Hmm.
And even when it comes to the Vulcans, I think there's only been one or two Vulcan characters in the show so far in terms of the episodes we watched. I know there was one where the actors who played Kalar, um, during it's the one where Data meets the guy who trained Sung, and that guy possesses Data's body.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
can't remember the name of the episode,
I don't remember the name offhand
but
either.
that was a Vulcan character who was like a medical
Hmm.
who was a doctor. Yeah, she was
Hmm.
Dr. Solar.
Dr.
Dr.
Samar.
Solar.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. But you don't see a lot of Vulcans, and you would think since Vulcans were kind of integral to the formation of Federation, you would see their presence a lot more in Starfleet. Now, in Enterprise, it's very clear that, you know, in the time frame of that show, there's still a real cultural and somewhat racial separation between the humans and the Vulcans, where the Vulcans have their own level of technology that they're keeping separate from the humans as the humans progress with their own warp technology. But they also have like their own military, their own, level of weaponry. There is this kind of wall between humanity and Vulcans, and I think it's kind of implied by the way you see Next Generation that maybe that wall is never crossed. Maybe the Vulcans have just stayed on Vulcan, and like instead of, you for every Solar or Tuvok or Spock even, most people still choose like go work for the Vulcan Science Academy, or if they're military minded, they go work for the Vulcan Navy, or something like that. But I think it's becoming a conceit on the show that like there's just a lot of humans around, and even if they're aliens, they're for the sake of casting,
Yeah.
everyone's going to be a humanoid.
Well, it's like when you get to the very end of the Enterprise, season, what was it, 4 seasons, and before the Federation. I mean, it was a lot of peacemaking between the Vulcans and the Andorians and the Tellarites. And you would think
Right.
that you would see, as the Federation formed and Starfleet, grew. Actually, Starfleet was initially all Terran, all from Earth, but you'd expect to see a little bit more of other species within the Federation. And we,
Right.
as we're discussing, we just don't see a lot of that.
Right. I think I know for the new, sorry folks, I think Ayo huh, but for the new show, Strange New Worlds, I know there is going to be an Andorian character on the
Mm.
crew, so I
Hmm.
think that'll be interesting to
Hmm.
watch.
Hmm.
But one thing that I think you bring up and we still haven't really touched on, why aren't the Vulcans here doing their own research on this? Um, d- I don't think they've ever been culturally closed off, and there's always been an understanding like they have shared cultural aspects with the Romulans. Why wouldn't they want to explore their shared cultural aspects with the Mintakans? Now, we know that like the Vulcans kind of engender the philosophy of the Prime Directive in the Federation. In fact, they're one of the reasons they kind of withhold their technological sophistication from humans as we develop our Warp 5 technology is this idea that, like, if they interfere with us too much, we will be somehow adversely affected. Um, why do you think a culture would not want to study a cousin of itself? I know that's a speculative question, but if we had to play, like, okay, there's a reason for this.
I can't think of a good reason. I think it could be just story writing that,
Right.
one of the themes is just, how do you deal with the prime directive when you're doing this hidden observation, this covert observation, and things go kerflooey, and I mean, once the Mintakans see the Federation people, Picard tries to control the exposure, but it keeps getting worse and worse and
But
worse.
well, let's get
So
into that. So,
yeah, so
so
I think the answer is the Vulcans not being there. It's just just the way the story is written to keep the story going.
right. Part of it, if I can throw this in there before we move on, one of the things Enterprise deals with is this kind of there's a level of xenophobia that the Vulcans have towards humans, and maybe and the Romulans too show a definite level of xenophobia towards humans. Maybe to a certain extent, like because of the Bronze Age level of the Mintakans, the Vulcans have no interest in them because not only do they have this kind of philosophy of already of like not breaking a prime directive, but also like what is really the interest for them meeting these people that are essentially their outdated
Well,
cousins?
it could be at some point during the Enterprise series, Saval has a conversation with Admiral Forrest, and where Forrest figures says to Saval, "Are you telling me you're actually afraid of the humans?" And
Oh
Saval
yeah.
admits that we had civil war and a major war like your World War III, and it took us thousands of years to get over it.
Well,
You only humans took only 100 years.
right.
So it could be that the
Um,
Vulcans, they don't care about the Bronze Age because we need to watch what these damn Earth people are doing.
right. All of our focus for the rest of the time is what Earth is doing. Um, one thing that so I one of the interests that I have as a fantasy writer is Bronze and Iron Age history in terms
Mm-hmm.
of how I build my fantasy worlds. The definition of Bronze Age is very interesting here. Um, so they have developed complex bows, very sophisticated clothing. For people that quote unquote live in huts, these look like pretty well structured buildings that have things like courtyards and stairs, multiple levels. It's very clear that they are able to weave. If they're settled in one area, I have to imagine that they're planting. Um, and just even like the formation of their arrows, they don't have arrowheads, but they have like these quote unquote sharp tips on them. Um, there's no unless the show when we say Bronze Age, they're putting it in the context of like what the Vulcan Bronze Age was. These people have uh, far above the a level of the Bronze Age
Oh, yeah. Okay, I
technology.
see. Yeah, this is a good point. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, right.
Um, it's a very kind of I think one thing that writers do sometimes, especially when it comes to the history of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, I think we know so much about the classical period of history, the Greeks and the Romans, and from there going forward into like the medieval period, the Renaissance, even there's a big. I think there's more cultural literacy with that, and I think when we actually come to the process of like building in Bronze Age culture, building out an Iron Age culture, I think a lot of people just kind of wing it. And I think even in the 80s, a lot of people were just saying, like, oh, these people are backwards and rural, so that's Bronze Age.
Well, what I hear you saying is if you really look at how anthropologically the Bronze Age, the human Bronze Age is defined. The
Hmm.
Mintakans are really far beyond that, which
Oh
also
yeah.
this kind of will help us. We don't need to jump ahead, but it's something that'll come up. Is that once the Mintakans are given the opportunity to understand who and what Picard is, they're
Hmm.
able to make the jump from believing in deities and that,
Oh
like,
yeah.
boom, they
Well,
just all of a sudden say, oh, well, we're going to be just like these
well,
people someday. It's like,
well,
how can you guys accept this?
well. Before we get to that jump, and we're jumping ahead a lot because this episode is actually very compact in terms of what the story is dealing with. Like it stays very laser focused.
Yes.
Um, so let's get to what causes the actual problem. So the crew of the Enterprise D arrives at Mintaka 3, and they beam down with Geordi, Data, and Commander Riker, so they can repower the station and basically deal with the wound. Oh, Beverly Crusher comes too. I always, for some reason, I forget Beverly Crusher in this episode, but she's there a lot. So like, there's wounded. People have been burned. One person is severely injured. And they
Mm.
beam them and Beverly. Oh, and there's I think Ensign Martinez or Lieutenant Martinez, who's Beverly Crusher's aide. I think he's actually a doctor. But they beam the wounded back up to sick bay, and Geordi and Data go along the process of restoring power to the station, restoring the cloaking device or the holographic projector on the duct blind. Before they do this, one of the Mintakans named Liko is out with his daughter and finds a duct blind, and he climbs up to examine it, and he looks inside and sees these beings that look nothing like him doing this wondrous thing with his technology, and he falls, and he has this terrible fall where he lands directly on his back, and it's very well depicted that like he is suffering intense neurological damages and is on his way to death when Beverly Crusher rushes down from the duck blind and decides then and there to beam him back up to sick bay. So before we get to like what happens in sick bay, I think it needs to be established some cultural details that we've been given about the Mintakans up to this point. We know that they have a quote unquote Bronze Age culture. One thing that is remarked about the Mintakans is that they long ago gave up a belief in the supernatural, and like that's established early on in the episode.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
when Liko falls and is beamed up, he is brought to sick bay, and his daughter Oji also sees Crusher beam her father up. This creates a conundrum for Picard because there is a immediate breaking of the Prime Directive because of Doctor Crusher's dedication to her patients. And I actually think that this is a interesting point in the episode that I wanted to touch on with you. There is a there is a real tension in this episode between Crusher and Picard almost immediately when he sees Liko in sick bay, to the point where they have this interaction where she's like, "Well, what do you expect me to do? Let him die?" And Picard basically says yes. Um, you know, choosing between the Prime Directive and serving your patient, fulfilling your Hippocratic oath. I would have rather you let this man die down on the planet. I think that this is act. At first, I wanted to get your reaction to this kind of interaction or dialogue between them, but I also wanted to note that this is the first episode where Rick Berman's the executive producer, and this is really where the tone of the show, I think, has really started to take a pronounced turn. Like, there's a real tension between some of the characters. There's a little bit of a darker overtone to things, and some more moral and ethical complications, like real, and I think we're talking about some real areas of gray here tonight. But getting back to the initial question, what did you think about this interaction between Picard and Crusher when it came to the treating of Liko for his injuries?
On a sort of a larger level, um, Picard's right. I mean, if you're there to, you're trying to observe this culture discreetly, respect the prime directive. If you want to keep that, you know, respect, or in this case, facade going, you should let Liko die. However, from a moral perspective, since you could make the argument that Liko's injury was caused by, you know, an equipment malfunction of
which it
Federation
was.
equipment, then the Federation is responsible for his injury. And thus, Dr. Crusher can easily make the moral and medical ethical decision that I'm transporting him up to sick bay because he's fallen, he either has spinal damage or most likely he's got, subarachnoid or subdermal hematoma that needs to be repaired with technology that's only available in sick bay. So, once Picard and Crusher had that conversation, Picard articulates that, well, it may have been better that you just let him die, but now that he's
Mm-hmm.
there, he sort of accepts the reality that, well, I've got to deal with this, and that's where he tries to control things, and he immediately things start to spin out of control. That he gets another as Liko wakes up in this semi-conscious state, and he sees
Right.
Picard, and he hears the conversation. It's like the situation gets worse.
Well, I have to say, one beautiful thing about the scenes in sick bay, when Liko awakes and he first sees Picard, or the Overseer, as he will later term him, based on Mintakan mythology. Uh, I have to say, the shot and the way they introduce the idea of Picard the Divine is really stellar. The way that the light is kind of
Mm-hmm.
cascading and
Mm-hmm.
volumetric in Leto's kind of
Mm-hmm.
concussed vision,
Mm-hmm.
and if you look at it, like, Picard is giving orders, he's walking around, he's actually talking into the air and giving commands. So from Liko's perspective, I think it's very good. I think the director and the producers of this scene did a great job, and the crew did a great job in realistically building a situation where Liko could go back and say, I witnessed this thing,
And
and it was a real thing to me,
right, and
because it
since
was a real thing, and it's a great way to misinterpret it, and it speaks a lot about perception. It's a great way to misinterpret the real for the supernatural or the divine.
well, he didn't understand what happened to him, and he wakes up in a
Right.
completely environment, a situation he doesn't understand, and you can see where he thinks that, well, I've died, and this overseer, this Picard entity, has brought me back to life, which brings up to one point you just kind of, I didn't have this in my notes, but you bring it up. There was a comment made during the show that the Mentakans have abandoned their belief in the supernatural, which
Hmm.
you mentioned. Like, okay, well, how is, if Liko looks at Picard as a deity, then aren't they still believing in the supernatural? Or can you make a
So
distinction between supernatural and the concept of God or a God?
I love that you brought up this question, because I would like to redirect it and reframe it into something fairly um well, it's a very brutal phrasing of it, but I called you earlier today before
Right.
this episode so
Yes.
we could do pre-production, and there was two questions that I wanted to ask you, and I asked you and I said think about these for the episode. So you're kind of leading me to the first question.
Okay.
Um do we create the supernatural or God to deal with the trauma of death? Um, so one thing, so you bring up a really good point that the Mintakans, and it's been noted in the show, that they abandoned their belief in the supernatural. But Liko immediately assumes when waking up in sickbay that he has died and he has gone to the afterlife. And when he's beamed back down unconscious and quote unquote with his memory wiped, which Crusher did not like doing, and we could get into that for a little bit, but um, when he gets back and has his memory wiped, he immediately has this kind of acceptance of the supernatural as being a real and meaningful force in the universe. So essentially, this entire idea of abandoning the supernatural, he abandons the abandonment of the supernatural.
Hmm.
His atheism goes right out the
Hmm.
door.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that is noted is that Liko and OG, a year
OG being
beforehand, or
OG being
Liko's
Liko's
daughter,
daughter, right?
right? Um, Liko and his daughter OG lost Liko's wife a year before during the floods. And one thing that is persistent through the the episode is Liko assuming that Picard is the overseer, since Picard brought Liko back to life. Liko will be able to bring his wife back to life. And I think this reflects something very interesting about accepting the trauma of death. Not even about oneself, but using the or having to deal with the trauma of losing another. And I think the question I'm asking, in our trauma, do we create God or the supernatural to explain the trauma of our loss, or to
Well,
explain our loss, or give it meaning, so to speak? What do you think?
we're going to get in real trouble in real, because it's kind of what I'm going to say is kind of perhaps a refutation of the Bible that says God was there before everything else. And,
Right.
that gets into a totally different question: is where did the universe come from? Who or what created it? Which says, okay, maybe God did that. So we're not here to figure that eschatological question out now. But in terms of humans, whether they're Bronze Age humans on Earth or Proto-Vulcans on Mintaka 4, I think, just from a being experience, that once a species, particularly a physical humanoid species, as the Mintakans are, once they get to a point of sentience and knowledge and able to understand their environment, that the concept of God first comes up in just trying to figure out, why are we here and who made this? And
Mm-hmm.
once they understand, once they got to start chewing on that, and they understand that they're mortal beings, then it kind of segues into the question is, okay, if we're born and we die, why were we made that way? And then
Mm-hmm.
there tries to be some rationalization as to why we are mortal and why we die, and that gets into, you and I personally talked about this before, where religion does become, um, you know uh, crutch is not the right word, but it becomes a tool to try
Mm-hmm.
to deal with our mortality.
Right. Well, I think that
And I just add one more thought to that. So much of Christianity is focused on, you need to be saved so that your sins are taken on Jesus, so that when
oh,
you die, you go to heaven. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But is that really why Jesus came to earth? Is that really his message, which we've talked about numerous times?
so I wanted to bring this up, and it segues into a certain thing. But one thing that you said in your notes is that you recently read about a Episcopalian priest who recently passed away that had advocated for ending the supernatural aspects of Christianity. And this gets into Troy's
Yeah.
statement. Um, Troy says that the problem with believing in a supernatural being is that they present the problem of trying to determine what he or she wants.
Right. That because that was in the context of um, Lico saying, you know, we angered the Picard. You know,
Right.
if we do what the Picard wants, then my wife, he will restore my wife and OG's mother and so forth. And we don't want to piss the overseer of the Picard off. And and then it gets into when things start getting hot and heavy with the thunder and lightning and so forth, which is interpreted that the Picard is mad at the Mintakans. That's when, Troy's comment during a conversation with the Picard really comes into play that, and you can look at history, of so many
Mm-hmm.
events where, people say, well, I'm doing this because I believe that this is what God wants. And
Mm-hmm.
it might have to do with killing millions of people or going to
Mm-hmm.
war for unethical reasons and so forth. And
Oh,
you know,
enslaving an entire race of people for
oh
economic
yes,
gains.
yes,
Yeah.
oh yes, probably a really good timely example. Exactly,
Yeah.
because slavery was uh, going back into the 16th century and 17th century when the African slave trade really started. And even back in the Old Testament, it was biblically sanctioned.
Oh yeah. Well, even Jesus, in certain places says like he's not there to he is there to fulfill the law, but he's not there to oppose it. And there are laws written in the Old Testament that like people can live by that allow you to have slaves. There's
Hmm.
also like laws that allow you to have multiple wives. So it's very interesting when it comes to the question of like really figuring out what is the intention of I think a supernatural deity in terms of determining the mundane means of our existence. And I think one thing that like Liko is trying to do, and it's somewhat interesting that and maybe it gets back to one flaw that I'm now seeing in the story. He leaps so hard to the supernatural, and not only to like the potential of the supernatural bringing back his wife, but to the potential of like the supernatural. Like when the thunder and lightning starts, he literally thinks like it's too early in the season. But the elder of his village, I need to try to find this character's name again.
Oh, the man, I don't
Uh,
remember his name. Yeah.
it's not Fento. Oh, it's Hallie, played by James McIntyre.
Okay.
Hallie even says like, well, no, we know in the past that certain seasons that these thunderstorms come early, but like just the fact that like Liko said like, oh, it's the card, he's angry at us. Like, there's just this automatic assumption like that has to be it, and part of it I wonder is like, so I have had um what I would call what I would call ecstatic experiences, both of the spiritual nature and also of the psychedelic nature. But the thing about those, and I can only speak from my own experience, folks. Um, but the one thing that I can say in reflection, and I think maybe it says something about the writers and how they perceive religiosity. I never had a psychedelic or spiritual experience that made me suddenly think that, oh, the clouds aren't accumulations of moisture, lifted from the earth because it's being heated and that they're gathering once they're cooling. Um, I don't suddenly think that the earth is, the sun is actually revolving around the earth, or God is setting the time and distance of all the planets in heaven. I, I've gone through these religious and ecstatic experiences, and I never lost grasp of the scientific or the rational, in my opinion. I find it very interesting that in a society that's supposedly let go of the supernatural, Liko's character grabs onto it so hard and refuses to let go. What do you think causes this? Do you think it really is? Do you think it's the trauma of losing his wife, or do you think And is it Arthur C. Clarke, or I think it's Arthur C. Clarke who says at some point technology gets so advanced it just seems like magic. Um, do you think that this might be part of like a God, what is it? People who've died on the table and then seen the other side and then come back.
Oh, I can't think of what the common name for that phenomenon is. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, I guess the one thing I was thinking about is that fits in with this primary
yeah,
question
because I
you
went
asked
on.
is when Picard, things get he things get worse in terms of trying to comply with the prime directive or not completely blow things with the Mintakans. So Troy identifies that Nuria um, is sort of a community leader, which I made a comment, is it more of a matriarchal society we're dealing with, or is just Nuria just a strong leader?
Uh, so
But anyway,
let's touch on that real quick because we
well,
can we
let
can get
come back to that
yeah,
because this comment I wanted to make relates to what we were talking about before.
of course.
When Picard brings Noria up to the Enterprise and shows her everything, and he goes through the logic pathway with her is that I'm mortal like you, and we used to live in huts, and we made you know things better, and you had ancestors that used to live in caves, and now you live in huts. So it's just like we used to live in huts, and now we're in starships. She accepts that, but then she asks about bringing there were some young
Multiple
men,
people,
yeah, that
multiple
died in the
people.
floods back to life. And he
Right.
goes, oh, shit, she's not getting it. So then the opportunity arises where one of the
I
anthropologists,
would call
Dr.
it
Mary Warren,
opportunity.
well, yeah, well, the situation,
Yeah.
the situation comes up where he's called to sick bay because Dr. Mary Warren, who is injured, is going to die. Dr. Crusher cannot
Right.
save her. So
Great
Nuria,
scene, by the way.
yeah, Nuria sees that Mary Warren dies and says,
Yeah.
Picard, bring her back. And he says, Nuria, I can't bring her back. And then it gets back to the whole question about, death and do we create religion in order to deal with death? And in this case, in this more primitive society, the answer is yes. However, once once Nuria is able to observe that Dr. Warren dies and that Dr. Crusher and all the
Mm-hmm.
technology there and the Picard cannot bring her back, then she makes that jump that, well, he really isn't a god. He is an overseer. He can't bring people back to life.
Yeah, they're not superior beings.
They're not superior beings. Exactly.
Which, is interesting because I think it gets getting to the question I asked about, do we create God or the supernatural to deal with our fixation or our fear of death? I mean, it seems like there's such a hope that the gods have arrived or that these superior beings have arrived to help us. And I think there is something kind of interesting about looking at God from a quote unquote Bronze Age perspective versus the 24th century perspective. In the 24th century perspective, it's very much being presented by the writers of the show and by the characters, especially through Picard, that the idea of God in the 24th century has kind of been disconnected from rational conversation or rational decision making. Like, people still have their religions, people still have their cultures, but when it comes to the nitty gritty of deciding, like, how we're getting the starship from point A to point B, Jean-Luc Picard is not saying a prayer before he sits down in the chair.
No, and one of the comments I made, I think that what represents my view of how God is represented or portrayed in Next Generation is it's a there's a Gestalt like presence beyond the
Yes.
collective human species, so that there's pieces of God of deity that exist in in the way humans experience life, experience the universe in the 24th century. And if you put them all together, the whole idea of Gestalt, that the total is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
That's where it comes together. Like, I can remember in some episode where Picard talks about that, and he talks about, I would hope that there is something larger than just us.
Right. Right. Oh yeah. It's the second episode, the one where they're dealing with Nagilum.
Ah, yes, that's right.
Like, I
Yes,
can't remember titles tonight.
right,
Where the silence holds least? No. But it's the second episode of the second season.
right.
I'm remembering weird things recording this show
No, that's
now.
good. That's good. Yeah, yeah.
But I think on one hand, um, one thing that I think helps Nuria finally accept this, and it gets back to what I was saying about Arthur C. Clarke. His quote that at some point technology gets so advanced it just seems like magic. Um, I think the thing that defeats magic, and this is probably getting to the question of like sleight of hand or illusions. Not if you have a belief in ritual or ceremonial magic, that's a different conversation. But I think there is this idea that Nuria and Likos have, going up to the Enterprise, and this is true in the episode Justice, when they bring up one of the dwellers on the planet who think that their god is going to punish Wesley Crusher.
Mm,
They're just they're just amazed at the technology around them that they see on the Enterprise D, especially Nuria, more so than the lady from Justice. But looking around, it's very easy to imagine in a certain way that you've been beamed up to heaven, and that this is kind of like this floating palace in the clouds, or even beyond the clouds, like you're among the stars. If you didn't have that scene of Dr. Mary Warren dying on the table, um, I think in some ways, and it's going to sound weird, but the way to reverse the problem of people um, dealing with death by cleaving to the supernatural or cleaving to God is by having them confront the reality of death as just something that is completely out of the control of God or us or anything. It's just a natural part of the universe that is completely out of our hands and is just part of the process. I think the show does a really fascinating thing psychologically and philosophically by choosing to do this with the storytelling. Um, in some ways, and I wanted to ask you this because at one point in your career in iBanking, you were working as a not a tissue. Well, what's the proper term for the person that goes to the morgue and like get extracts the corneas?
Basically, a recovery technician.
You were well. You helped actually set up the first recovery techs and actually helped build the kit that they used for extract helping them recover the corneas.
What corneas only? Yes, right.
Yeah, but like let's give you a pat on the back here. That's a big deal. You were one of the first ones who actually go into morgues and do things like that. I have to ask you, seeing death at that level and dealing with the dead at that level, um, did it change any of your belief systems? Did it change your views on the universe, your place in it? Just if you could give a reflection on seeing the dead and dying, or seeing the dead, um, how do you think that changes people? And when you see Nuria's reaction to Mary Warren dying and her coming to acceptance, did you find something realistic in that, or do you think it's more just for dramatic effect? Like the sobering of it.
Well, see, my experience was really never seeing someone die. They were already dead. And
Right.
I saw a lot of people dead, and I saw them die from natural causes to traumatic causes to decomposed bodies to completely charred bodies who died in house fires. Um,
Oof.
People that committed suicide, uh, jumping in front of an Amtrak metro liner going 120 miles an hour, and they were literally put in a big, thick green plastic bag and brought to the medical examiner's office and put back together like a puzzle so you could identify them. And, um, I remember one time there was they got deaners that work in the medical examiners and morgues, and I was standing talking to somebody, and one of the deaners said, "Hey, Jake," and he turned around. He wanted to upset me because he was holding up a severed human head by the hair. And I just said, just go on, Paul. Didn't bother me, and it didn't change anything philosophically other than, I think young people have a sense that they're immortal, that, I'm 20 years
Hmm.
old, I'm 21, I'm not going to die. I don't need to worry about this. And I think it just gave me a sense that didn't scare me or anything like that, but it just, taught me that, to accept that, this is a mortal body I'm in. And
Hmm.
if it happens, it happens. And particularly people that die accidentally, you never know when it's going to happen. Something you just
Hmm.
said a while ago about how, you know, God doesn't cause deaths or, people, it happens. They were just thinking there was a story, there was somebody, a school teacher in the local town where we live in North Carolina who don't know the details, but she elected not to get vaccinated for COVID-19. And she got sick
Yeah.
and she died. And one of her last words were to her children and her students was, please get vaccinated. And it's like, you know, God, people say, well, God did that. It's God's will. It's God's plan for that person. No, it wasn't. This person made a choice that
Right.
they rolled the dice and they lost by choosing
Right.
not to get vaccinated. And I'm just bringing that up in terms of this conversation about, you know, death, how it occurs, and so forth. I'm not making a political statement, any of that
Right.
sort of thing, whether you're
Well,
like vaccines, don't like vaccines, anti-vax, all that stuff.
I think it's important to note that in the point you're making, when it comes to actually, I promise, I'm going to get there. I want to phrase this correctly. um, so I think when it comes to like the actual suddenness and the inevitability of death, I think what you're saying is that, there is at some point like a decision making process that goes into it. That, you know, you have seen there's just a recognition that like people die for these reasons. And if you can just connect them to these reasons, it really does take away a lot of the suffering and a lot of the fear of it, because there really is a more, I wouldn't say a scientific perspective of it, but there is a more rationalized perspective of like, hey, this is just something that happens to the human body versus oh, my spirit's been claimed by the gods, or, some far more metaphysical and supernatural cause. It's just the kind of acceptance that, like, hey, at some point there's an end.
Well, it's there's a causality that
Right.
if you're a
That's what I
young
was looking for.
African American living in an inner city in America and you get into gang culture and drugs, that's a choice that leads to a higher possibility of you getting killed, in some conflict. If you're working on, because this is something that happened, there's a guy working on a construction site, and somehow why he chose to stick his head out from the barrier some, and he ended up getting decapitated when a truck ran over his head. I
Right.
mean, it just totally freak accident and so on. What's the causality, when people got on United Flight 93 and a
Right.
couple hours later they ended up in pieces in Shanksville, Pennsylvania?
Right. Well, I think the difficult thing is that we want to pin. I think that we want such an explanation to the causality that, and this gets back to the original question, like, do we create God to deal with the
Mm.
trauma? I
Hmm.
think part of dealing with trauma is being able to nail down the aspect of its causality. Like, here's the point where the trauma starts, and here's the point where it's supposed to end. And the hard thing about death is that you can't ever, like, I think you made a really good example of the gang member versus the construction worker, because both of them chose to go into jobs or go into lifestyles where they're facing high risks. They're just automatically in high risk scenarios all the time, and if they make one sort of mistake, like, the the outcome may be that they lose their lives. I would also include, like, if you are a if you are a well, no, never mind. I'm not going to make that one. That's a little bit of a stretch. Never mind, folks. Um, but the point about causality, I think, really stands up well, because death, in some ways. Oh, okay. Sorry. Here's a good one. That's the one I was going to make. Um, or the one that I should make. Ha. Uh, if you are, if you come from a family where you deal with people that have chronic obesity
Mm.
that results in heart disease and diabetes, and you continue to eat or live in a way that's unhealthy, and you develop diabetes or greater, heart or an acute heart condition or
Hmm.
heart disease,
Hmm.
the question is, well, where was the causality then? Was it did it get started with your family in terms of their overall behavior, or was it your continuing the behavior that
Hmm.
led to your death?
Hmm.
The truth is, when it comes to that question, there's no real way of pinning down an easy answer to it. And I think what Liko and what Nuria want is they not only want the losses that they've incurred to be fixed, but I think they also want an explanation to the cause of it. I think by saying, like, oh, God decided to take these lives from us, or the overseer decided to take my wife from me as a way to punish me or to test my faith. I think that that's much easier than, I think, sometimes accepting the reality of, like, okay, they were in a car crash and died, or oh, they got cancer, or one that we have to live with in 2020 and one in America. They were out at a mall or a school or church, and someone pulled out a gun. Like, the causality of that is so hard to pin down in all those cases,
Hmm.
but you want to give meaning to them.
Well, it's like the FBI statistics came out today that in 2020, or I guess 2021 so far, the homicide rate in the country's up like 30%. And, they
Hmm.
tried to explain, sociological reasons for it. And, two things that came out is that a lot of people bought guns because they figured there's
Hmm.
going to be problems because of people being stuck at home. But a lot of it's, I think, just societal stress. And a lot of people were first time gun owners, so they're stuck at home with their spouse or their family, and they get each other's nerves. So they got the gun, so they don't know what to do with it. It's something new, so they end up shooting each other.
Oh, I think a lot of this. So I think the pandemic has, and Ben, if you're listening to this later on, it's September of 2021. Well, about to be October. But I think that the stress of the pandemic, especially, has been a constant confrontation with the idea of death
Mm-hmm.
and trying to find, everything from us talking about in previous episodes, the lab leak theory in China to um, the possibility of like the craziness around the ivermectin debate. All of this is surrounding the idea of there's something out there that could kill people in mass that if we don't deal with seriously, it's going to cause real damage. And there are people, as we see every day, irregardless of their not irregardless, that's not a real word. I think it is now, but regardless of their
Right,
religion,
right.
but regardless of their religion or their rationality, are willing to embrace um, conspiracy and irrational thought to deal with this real kind of. I think we're having a cognitive moment in our human history, and I think looking at the Mintakans versus the 24th century society that Picard's coming out of. I think one illusion that I keep making on the show is the difference between now and the Black Death. So, like, in the Black Death, they thought God was killing all these people. Like, most of the people thought God is giving us buboes, God is bringing the rats, God is causing, like, me to lose my child in 8 hours because they caught the plague. Versus, us now, where we know that this is a virus. We know that it mutated this way. We know that there's this vaccine that we can take that can knock down the symptoms if someone catches it. We know that this is how it mutates and how it spreads. We have all of these explanations that don't involve God at all. And I think that this is a good way of explaining the huge gap in, I think, maybe perceptual differences between the Mintakans of the Bronze Age, quote unquote, Mintakans, um, and the Federation of the 24th century. Like, the Federation would readily accept that, like, the coronavirus is a virus, while the Mintakans would be like the overseers punishing us with COVID. And I think, even here in America, on the evangelical side, there's a lot of people who believe that COVID is God's punishment, just
Well,
as much as
it's
they believe.
well, go
Well,
ahead.
they
Yeah.
believe everything God is
Well,
God's
back when
punishment.
HIV came up, HIV was God's punishment against gay men.
Oh, well, I remember. Well, for Christians, and if you're Christian, sorry if you. Well, no, we're picking on you, but sorry to pick on you, but you got yourself in this position. Um, During Katrina, and I think that was 2000. When was Katrina? 2005.
I think it was 2005. Yeah,
Yeah,
2005. Yeah.
like I remember John Hagee, who was this Texas preacher that was John McCain's personal minister and a diehard evangelical. He came out and no, it was Pat Robinson. I'm sorry, Pat Robinson, 700 Club, another famous American evangelical. He basically came out and said that Hurricane Katrina came and devastated New Orleans because New Orleans was a den of homosexuality. So, like, we Christians have been blaming the gays for everything forever. If it's not the gays, it's the Jews' fault.
Right.
So like,
Yes.
but
Right.
this speaks to kind of like the irrationality of trying to like, even if it's not, even if they didn't, if Ligo didn't have the overseer, what if there was another species of humanoid on the planet of Mintaka 3? There's a very good chance that like Ligo would be like, well, it was these people that took my wife, or it was these people that caused the problems.
Well, we've kind of beat up the question you asked, which is really the second question, and kind of get to the first question.
Right.
What happens in toward the end, where it kind of gets resolved, is Nuria, as Liko is about to sacrifice Troy to.
Well, before we get there, let's fill in the audience to how we
Yeah, go
get to
ahead.
this
Yeah, go
first.
ahead.
So they bring up Liko, and they suddenly realize, after sending him back down to the planet, they have to figure out if there's been any cultural contamination. So they send down Troy and Riker dressed up as Mintakans. They actually have their features fixed to look like Mintakans, which I think is interesting. In the future, that means like you could have temporary plastic surgery, um, which I think is a huge medical breakthrough in certain things. Like, those burn victims that you
Yeah,
were talking about? Like, if they had
right.
lived, you might be able to make sure they look like
No,
they were never burnt.
no. The crispy critters cannot be fixed. Go ahead.
No, 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 but in the 24th century of Star Trek, they could be. Because look, like they can alter Troy's and Riker's features to make them look like full Mintakans. Like there's no, they even say in the script like there's evidence that like they have actually altered their features. It's not like they're adding prosthesis.
Yeah,
So,
they do this frequently. They say they're surgically altered.
but
Yeah,
I think the point that I'm trying to make is that in the future, like if you had someone that had severe burns, they have the methodology and the treatments there to basically heal them back 100%.
right.
Um,
Possibly. Yes,
because
in the future.
if they can do this, they could probably do that. So they send them down, and immediately they discover that yes, there's been a cultural contamination because Liko's memory has actually remained cogent, and uh, Pulaski's methodology of removing his
Short term.
short-term memories did not take hold. Um, Troy and Riker, try to insert themselves into the Matakan society as it's present there, and suggest that Liko's and Oji's experience is a dream until one of the anthropologists who is missing, Palmer, is found. Suddenly, the mission becomes not only about saving Palmer, who is injured, but also furthering the case of not violating the Prime Directive. So, the first question I asked you earlier today, um, once the Prime Directive is broken and they know you're there, what's the point of keeping up this charade?
Well, before I answer, well, I can answer the question now, and the answer would be
Obviously for TV, but
probably, well, yeah, and probably be the same even at the end of the episode. Is I think you get to a point where you've revealed enough that you can't go back, so that the
right,
Prime Directive is broken, and
right.
the only way to fix it is to, um, I mean, and this has happened. There's two ways you can have. Um, in this case, what they do is they just come clean with the Mintakans, and
Right.
it really kind of does get into the end of the story because after you know Riker gets Edwards and has to go through this, has to run away and hide in a place so he can beam back
Palmer.
up
Palmer.
with Palmer. Riker has to
Sorry.
beam back up with Palmer, and then Troy's left there, and um, Liko is so into the Picard and so forth, and we've angered the Picard. We have the assuage to Picard that he wants to sacrifice Troy. And since
Good
Troy's
word.
basically on an open mic communication, then Picard beams back down with Nuria, who's been convinced since she's seen the death of Dr. Warren that no, they're mortal, they're just like us. And it's at a key moment when Lico, what happens is Picard says, "Look, to demonstrate to you." Actually, it's an interesting scene because Picard really puts the Prime Directive to the test, and says, "Look, just to prove to you that I'm not a god, that I'm mortal like you, shoot me. And if I die, I die." And Nico's arm gets knocked aside, and Picard is wounded, and he doesn't die,
That's
and
yeah,
but sees that he bleeds just like us, and then
right.
everything becomes clear and so forth, and they can have the conversation with Nuria, what she's seen in Liko, and they understand. And then they make this psychological jump that, well, we really, there is not this overseer and so forth, and we can develop and eventually become like these people. Um,
I,
but and then there's a future episode, the one where Riker has sex with the hospital worker to help him escape.
right,
It's a more advanced culture. They're almost no, the Enterprise goes because these people are close to warp and they're observing them. Riker's down there observing them. And he
right.
gets injured or something, and you know, Picard ends up having to talk to the head of the planet and so forth. And it's determined that
Yeah, okay. I remember this episode now.
and
Yeah,
it's determined that because
it's a
of
good episode.
how the head of security can't accept the fact that aliens, he sees them as a threat, that the head of the planet realizes that we're really not mature enough. So he
But
says, well, what'll happen is, it'll just be in the television that there are these aliens and it'll go away, and it's really a key thing because it mirrors our society as what
right.
could be happening now, and this was written back in 1990 or 91.
Well, I have to say the difference between that story and this story is that uh, getting to the main question of like, does the Prime Directive matter? I think the moment Picard comes down and is shot with the arrow, and then has that conversation with them where he shows them the duck blind, and they even have this, and he even has it with Nuria, where Nuria is like, one day we can be up here and explore the galaxy. And Picard says, "Of that I have no doubt." Um, my my criticism of this part is like, okay, they know now. So like, just leaving them there with like out any knowledge, like they already have knowledge that there are people out there that have greater levels of technology, um, that far outstrip them, and that if they keep somehow if they if somehow keep progressing naturally, they're going to one day end up as a work capable civilization. That's a lot of assumption on Picard's end, and like there's no guarantee that somehow like the moment he beams up, they're like, "Oh, calculus. Why didn't we think of that?" Or astrophysics. Why didn't we think of that? I think to a certain extent, once the prime directive's broken here, like the Mintakans should be brought in because like they just know on a cultural level that like they there is no this kind of like, oh, we can just go back to doing things the old way. Now, the point you made with the other episode, like you said, they were close to warp technology. So like I think the argument of like, oh, this is just something that will pass on TV and we'll get there one day, I think that's applicable there. But I think here, with them being Bronze Age, like they suddenly have an awareness that is far beyond what they had before.
Well,
And
I
like
think
there is no going back.
it might get into, if, again, this is all, science fiction, but, in this
Right.
episode with the Mintakans, it's like once you really, once you realize that the prime directive is broken, it's like,
Hmm.
screw it.
Right.
You can't put Humpty Dumpty back together. Now,
Well,
compared with a more advanced society, you could put Humpty Dumpty back together.
well, one point that I want to make about Humpty Dumpty here, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together with Mintakans like you could with this other society, but you also need to be worried about the Mintakans now in terms of like them being picked up by like the Romulans or Klingons. If I'm a raider in the galaxy and I suddenly know like, oh hey, there are these groups of people out there that are proto Vulcans that have an idea of my technology but don't have my technology, I'm going to go rob these people. um, it just seems to me like like the prime directive here has been so irrevocably broken that
Yes,
you might as well just admit them into the Federation
exactly.
now and just like here's your warp engine, here's your replicator, and like here's how we healed. Like I would literally beam Liko up and be like, here's how we healed you.
Now
Like
that's
let's
well, that's an interesting one. I'd have to think about that. That's I see where you're going with this. Yeah,
Well,
right.
like it's the other part of this. Like instead of beaming Nuri up, like you beam Liko up, or you do the harder thing. When Liko wakes up in sickbay the first time and sees the Overseer or sees the Picard, instead of putting him back to sleep, maybe that's the time where Picard goes like, "Well, we're screwed here. Let him up. Let me talk to him." And you say, "Hey, look, I'm not the Overseer, Liko. You broke your back, and we fixed your back."
Well, here's the question: is once Picard writes up the report and it gets back to Starfleet headquarters and
Right.
Federation, what are they going to say? What are they going to say?
Right.
How are they going to judge this and say, "Hey, you need to go to Federation prison for 6 months for doing it this way," or
Well,
you?
I
But
don't think any. Yeah.
yeah,
I
you
don't
know.
think anyone can be. I don't think anyone could be punished in this situation. Like, there was a malfunction with the duck blind. The Enterprise did what it was supposed to do. They showed up and fixed the situation. No one predicted Liko getting injured. Like once Liko's injured, like this thing is entirely fucked. If anyone gets in trouble, it really is Beverly Crusher. Like Beverly Crusher really does break the Prime Directive against orders on her own volition. Like she's not given the order to go down and
Well,
rescue
yeah. I mean, if
people.
you go back, if she had not beamed Liko up, that would have been the end of it, probably. I
Right.
mean,
So I
Oji would have seen something, but she may have not have enough information to figure anything out. She would have gone back and
correct.
told the other people in the village, and they would have said, "Oh, you're crazy."
Well, that's the other thing too. Like, with Nuria knowing what she knows now and Oji knowing what she knows now, like do you really leave like OG down on the surface of this planet to just be like, oh, I could be doing so much more in the galaxy? There's this kind of assumption like these people, like, can these people not learn? Like, even at the end of the episode, even Liko is sitting there philosophically waxing about how he now
Yes.
understands what's going on.
Oh, it's interesting what you just said. Do you keep once Noria knows? Do you just bring her on the Enterprise? Remember in
Yeah,
the other episode with the society that was just at the level of warp drive, what happens to the chief scientist on that planet? Remember?
right. Oh,
The chief scientist on the planet says to the president, he said, I've believed in this, that there are other species out there and that interstellar
right,
travel is possible. Now that I know this, I can't stay on this planet. Can I go with them?
right,
And Picard says, Mr. President, if you approve, she can come with us. And he says,
right.
yes, because the president knew that she would never be happy there.
Right. So this entire idea that somehow the Mintakan culture has not been irrevocably damaged by their cultural contamination by the Federation, like there's no like, oh, they beam up and Liko's like, yep, there's no overseer. It was just this guy in a spaceship. I'm going to go back to hunting people with my bow. you know, I think the ending here is really kind of not poorly done because it's a really good episode, but it's clearly science fiction. And one of the things that so Ira Stephen Bear, who is one of the main producers of DS9, one of the big differences with DS9 is that it has longer story arcs. It's less episodic TV and more, series. It's told there's more 2 and 3 part episodes than
Mm-hmm.
there are just, specific
Mm-hmm.
missions or things we're dealing with this week. One of the things that he remarked is the problem with this episode is that if you gave Picard or that cast a season to deal with like the Mintakans, like the entire season is about how do we deal with the Mintakans now that they've been culturally contaminated, you would have a very compelling story about how the Prime Directive works and what happens when First Contact goes wrong in this sense. But because of the nature of the writing of the episodes, because they're so episodic, and because they have to go to the next episode and the next mission and the next storyline next week, you kind of have to cut it off here. Um, but one thing before we go that I wanted to address, you have this question in your notes, and it'll be the last question for the night. Getting back to when Troy says the problem with believing in a supernatural being present is the problem of trying to determine what that supernatural being wants. Um, how does that previous thought square with like the ghost-like beings
Mm.
that show up on the Enterprise? Um, if you know that there are ghost-like beings that are quote unquote aliens, how does that? Where does spirituality? What can you better define your question in terms of
Um,
what you presented there in your notes?
it just, I mean,
It's
it gets
late, folks.
into it gets into the whole thing about, um, the statement that was made that we talked about how Mintakans. It stated that the Mintakans have abandoned their belief in the supernatural, but they still believe in, the overseer. So as we talked about, that doesn't necessarily fit. And then, the article I read recently about a Episcopalian priest who recently died that had advocated for the ending of the supernatural aspects of Christianity. I didn't have enough information on what he meant by the supernatural aspects. I assume that it would have to do with demonic possession and so forth.
Hmm.
And you studied that, and
Hmm.
there might actually be something to that. And then we have experiences that are kind of like um, Ghostbusters. It's pseudoscience where there is some pseudoscientific evidence that spirits of individuals exist after physical
Hmm.
death. So, um,
Well, I think
it
if you have that life at seeing the light and returning to your body phenomenon that we've
right,
observed in
right,
medical
right.
in clinical settings, you have to somewhat acknowledge the idea of that there is some sort of consciousness or spirituality after physical death.
So is when you get into um, again the term I use in my notes, ghost-like beings, is you either dismiss the supernatural or you say, well, yeah, there is a supernatural aspect and we can't scientifically understand it. And it's like sort of a if there is a actual God, a
Hmm.
deity, and then you have mortal humans. is there some level of existence, plane of existence, where these, ghost like beings exist, which really
Hmm.
fits into some of the beings we've seen in Next Generation, where they're pure, they're sentient, but they're pure energy.
Or they're able to cross the energy material
Yes,
border.
yes,
Like,
yes, exactly.
one person that I'm thinking in particular, and we'll see him later on in the season, is Q.
Yes.
Q really raises a lot of spiritual questions that are really difficult to,
Right.
corral. One being like, if he's not an omnipotent God being, and this is somehow a level of evolution or technology, um, the fact that he can cross into a realm of energy, which is, I guess, the Q continuum, or change his material state, it really brings into the question, do the definitions that we have for what makes the divine or makes the supernatural or make God actually fit into anything meaningful to the conversation?
Hmm.
Because if you had beings like this, and I was actually thinking about this recently, if you had aliens that were multidimensional, that means that they have found a way to, they too, like Q, have found a way to cross an energy barrier to where they are able to transmute their physical matter from one universe into this one. And if that is the case, like, what really is the nature of reality? If you're able to move between these two planes or move between dimensions or alter, in Star Trek, we can get into the larger question of, like, the transporter technology. If you're able to break down people to their very molecules and transfer them into energy and then move them from point A to point B and then, like, reconstitute them, what does it really mean to exist?
Well, it gets back to that article we read recently from The Economist on fundamental physics,
Right.
and talked about, there could possibly be 10 to the 500 universes.
Oh yeah. Well, like the the quant and I'm going to sound like an asshole saying this, but this will be the last thing I say. Um the quantum possibilities out there and the possible permutations that existence can take within our known, and now I think we have to grapple with this, the unknown universe. Um the possibilities are endless, but at the same time, with when the possibilities become endless, the structures and the rules and the constraints fall away too. So what you have to deal with becomes ineffable in a way, because what language is, and I think what we're talking about in terms of dealing with death and, kind of grappling with that, is building a language around something to understand it. When you do away with those constraints, you do away with the language. And if you don't have a language, how do you understand it?
Hmm.
Um, well, on that note, I think that we will end the episode. I think that Who Watches the Watchers is a really wonderful expression of Star Trek.
Hmm.
Um, do you have any final thoughts before we go?
Not really. I think we've done a good job, talking about a lot of the, interesting points that this episode brought up.
Right. And I think this was a truly enjoyable conversation. Dad, thank you so much for joining
Thank
me.
you, Jay. Yeah.
Um, we will be back next time for the bonding, which is episode 5 of season 3. Once again, Dad, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone at home,
You're
we'll see you
welcome.
next time.
Good night. Bye bye.
Night.